That's okay. Okay, before I introduce our speaker tonight, for the members of the Warmensville Civic Association. Okay, okay. Well, I got to stand on my tiptoes now. Oh, okay, for the virtual. Okay, just a couple of previews for coming attractions, you might say. We will go on hiatus or vacation after tonight for June, July, and August. And for our September program, we have a very interesting program, according to our friend Diane Durr. It's U.S. presidents in unusual places. Kind of brings to mind Clinton and Trump to me. So it should be very interesting, I think, and enlightening, I'm sure. And then our next one after that, we skip October, of course, and it will be November 8th, which will be the Mayor Michael O'Connor, and will be here in the clubhouse, and it will be virtual also. The one in September, on September 27th, will be only virtual. So we're trying to get people back into the clubhouse a little bit at a time, so to speak. And but we felt that the U.S. president's presentation will be really well done just virtually. So that's what to look forward to for the rest of the season for the Warmensville Civic Association. And tonight we have Phillip Greenwalt, who is the Chief of Interpretation and Education at the historic Catoctin Furnace, and he works at the Catoctin Mountain Park in Thurmont, and he also doubles as a public information officer. And I've learned after reading this that he is a native Baltimorean, a native Marylander, and he's a history buff, and doing graduate work. He studied the Civil War and the Revolutionary War, so he's got a lot of history to share with us tonight. So without further ado, Phillip Greenwalt. Thank you.
Well, I'll try to keep talking into the microphone. Being a National Park Service ranger, we kind of walk around. So you see me doing one of these, like I'll try to stay behind here, but thank you for the welcome. My name is Phillip Greenwalt. I came up in August of 2021 to take over the Chief of Interpretation, which is pretty much the Chief of Visitor Services for Catoctin Mountain Park, one of the National Park Service units. If we want to talk about presidents in weird places, we do have a little thing up there called Camp David. A few presidents have come around since Roosevelt in the 1940s. So I am a native Baltimorean. I still believe every year the Baltimore Orioles are going to win the World Series. This year is looking a little better. And I am actually the fourth generation of my family to have something to do with Catoctin. So this was coming home. I did in reverse. I was down in the Everglades for 7 years. So I retired to Florida and then unretired and came back. With that, though, I'd like to discuss this, the Catoctin Furnace and the history of the Catoctin Mountain Park. The furnace, especially as we come into the 250th of the United States. And so we're ramping up different events. So there's a long history that continues to be uncovered in the mountains. But first, does anyone know what the word Catoctin actually means? No. And, so Catoctin actually means land of many deer. And so it is a loosely translated Native American word. So if it feels like it's caught in the back of your throat, you're actually saying it right. So it's Catoctin. A young visitor today actually said, "Oh, like the TikTok video." I said, "Well, potentially." So, but why a furnace in what was considered Western Maryland at the time? Of course, Frederick County in the 1700s was kind of that western edge. If you look at the French and Indian War, Fort Frederick at the far extension, that was about as far as the British went. Actually, the colony of Maryland decided that anything past Fort Frederick, Virginia, and the Ohio Company could deal with. And so, you want to flip to the PowerPoint for people? Yeah. Hi, everyone online. Well, as he's getting ready, so the first slide there, which we'll come up to, is actually what the furnace looks like today. And it also has a portrait of course, Thomas Johnson. And he probably needs no introduction, having his name on the schools around here, one of the first governors of the freed state, or after the independent movement. But in going back farther in 1719, the Maryland State Legislature actually established that if you could run an iron mill, you would actually get about 100 acres free from the crown, and that the iron mill workers would actually be exempt from any public service, including the militia. So why did they want iron mills? Well, iron is very, very limited back in Great Britain. They imported about 200,000 pounds of pig iron per year to turn into the rods. And so if you want to flip to the next slide there. Anytime, yeah. If they have any questions, yeah, feel free to interrupt, raise your hand. And so initially, the state legislature tried to bring actually in German immigrants, German population, entice them into the colonies because they were more familiar with iron making than most English settlers. By this time, Great Britain rules the waves, Hail Britannia. And so they were used to building the ships, but they didn't know how to mine the iron. A lot of the forests in Great Britain and the British Isles were actually depleted. And so wood and this virgin timber was kind of a godsend. And so some of those families that initially came to this area, spreading from southern Pennsylvania down into Virginia, settled and became well known in other industries, including, if anyone's ever served the baby food, Gerber baby food, their ancestors actually came as iron mill workers. And so they settled here as indentured servants. That's why you have a lot of the German population, especially more into the western Frederick County, which in 1776 was split off and named Washington County in honor of George Washington. And the eastern side, Montgomery, was split off the name after Richard Montgomery, one of the first American generals killed in the Revolution. And so they split the county, but Frederick retained that high population. In 1768, though, Thomas Johnson there, the gentleman to the right, with his three brothers, actually got a tract of land called the Mountain Tract, and for them, the purpose of erecting or building the ironworks. Surprisingly, like today, the government bureaucracy moves slow, and so it took a few years for them to get everything executed. But by 1770, they had about 7,715 acres. And James Johnson, one of the four brothers, actually was the most skilled in iron making. And so he actually started the construction of the initial Catoctin iron furnace in 1774. And so the family actually in Eastern Maryland had tried to run an iron mill, come out here. And so at the beginning of the American Revolution, of course, the United States does not have the infrastructure. What is interesting about the colonies is that at the time of the American Revolution, you had the natural resources here, but to keep you tied into Great Britain, you actually had to ship it back. The pig iron, they turned it into iron bars, was shipped it all the way back to the United colonies, which then you made it into what you needed, but any finished products you sent all the way back. One of the other things you actually sent back from the colonies as well was manure. And that's where the S word comes from today. So, but the United States needed, the Continental Army needed munitions. They needed cannonballs and they needed musket balls. At one time, Washington's army is guarding Boston with 9 rounds per man. And so kind of hard to fight a battle. The Battle of Bunker Hill, for instance, the Americans actually ran out of bullets, and that's why the British were able to eventually take the hill. And so places like Catoctin Furnace started to create cannonballs to fire at the British. And some of the first shots at Yorktown, according to the Johnson family, we know the Marylanders never tell lies. They said some of the first shots actually at Yorktown were fired by Catoctin or cannonballs made at Catoctin Furnace. And so you can see there 100 tons of shells used at Yorktown. However, some of those shells might have been defective. And so it's by 1805, they have not been paid. The Continental, or by the time the US Congress, initially the Continental Congress or the Articles of Confederation Congress, that's not confusing enough, had reneged on their purchasing or their duties of paying the Johnson family for the artillery because some of them were deemed defective by the quartermaster in Baltimore. And so once again, you had a debate. They finally settled in 1805, and the family received some of the money there. The besides the Johnson, and you can move on to the next slide. So just a little bit about his timeline history there. 1738, of course, Fort Mechanicstown is founded, although it's not named until later. You have the Krieger and Veller families. 1748, so we're about to celebrate a big anniversary here in Frederick County. 1776 is officially when the furnace came in the building. And then 1803 is when Mechanicstown, with the nod to the tool makers, tanneries, millers, artisans. In 1894, they changed it to Thermont. Apparently they found a way to combine the German and French words there. 1903, the furnace, 54 is the bark. And then since we're throwing dates, I figured I'd throw where I was born in there too, just to give you a complete timeline there. So, and you can go on to the next slide if you like. So this, although is a later image of Mechanicstown, this is done prior to the American Civil War, but it kind of shows you Hunting Creek coming in, which the furnace would have sat right down below the tannery there. This is the oldest dated map that we have of the town of Mechanicsville or Thermont today, which is the main thoroughfare. And so you did have the road network. One of the roads coming in was what is now Route 77. We do know that was a historic Native American road trace. It actually connected to what is called the Great Indian or Great Warp Indian Path, which is now Route 11, goes down through the heart of the Shenandoah Valley. Later on, the Great Wagon Road, used by some of the forefathers of Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Jackson. And so that was the way through the hills. Catoctin had a lot of minerals, a lot of geological formation, and was actually known by Native Americans to they mined it themselves. They did something called rhyolite, which was used for arrowheads, used for tool implements. And also Catoctin was considered a hill of peace and quiet. And they actually told President Roosevelt later that that's one of the names for the mountain. And because Native Americans would actually call an unofficial timeout when they came to the Catoctin Mountains to mine that stuff. And as soon as they finished mining, they would leave, and then the truce would be over, and they would use what they mined to start shooting arrows at each other. So human history is amazing in that way. So that is mechanics down there. And you can go to. No, you are in the South, so you can you got to teach the women the proper things, language, rudimentary customs. Men, the major school subjects, of course, math, maybe French if you were very lucky. A lot of times math and science were the two big things. And some of these preparatory schools, including one of the military academies, was actually considered the greatest engineering school in the world, was West Point at the time. And so you separate them because females needed to learn the more delicate side of education, the men needed to learn the more practical side. And so, yes, ma'am. I think it's 1838. I have it, yeah, or 1838 or 1848. So right prior to the American Civil War. Yes, sir. So the creation of the operation there, there would actually be 4 iron mills that would work or would actually stand in the area. After the Johnsons won, they would own it into the early 1800s. After the early 1800s, we always move past my notes here, getting caught up here. So it would actually pass on to another family, and 1803, Baker Johnson became the sole owner of the furnace. 1830s, and the house here, Auburn, one of the houses that was used by the local owner of the iron mill. So after the Johnsons sold it, they lived in a house similar to this. And so by the early 1800s, most of the operation was run either by these German indentured servants that had up to the Revolution, 19th century. After that, mostly African American slaves. By the mid 19th century, they do know there was approximately 80 slaves that were operating. By the time John Bryan in 1820, a wealthy Irish immigrant, bought Catoctin Furnace, he actually improved some of the surrounding area, including building a chapel that would actually be part of the Episcopal diocese. What was that, ma'am?
Whose house is that?
So that is actually the Wells house there, or what would have been the Wells house. He's one of the later owners of the iron furnace. So it sits over top to the right of the furnace. That is the last one built in the late 19th century. What was that? That photo is taken on Sunday, yes. So that's what's left of the house. The image behind the African American slave girl there is actually what they believed it looked like when it was standing. Yes, there was actually 4 furnaces. No, that is the accepted name. The one that kind of gets looped in. There was actually the Lindsay furnace was one of the names of it. Where's the other? Got all 3 names here. No, Catoctin Furnace. What was the other one? The name here. Who came after the town as well. So it had official names. So Catoctin Furnace was one of the names that was used by the Johnson family with the Catoctin after the mountain trace. And so when the national park is formed, when the historic society that controls it is formed, Catoctin became a name to tie everything back in. And this one.
How was the technology for making things? How was it brought?
How was pig iron brought?
How was the technology?
For making it. So part of it, great question. This is how they're making the coat that is going to be used. And so, like I said, I'll walk away from the microphones. And so this is actually an artist rendition, 15 to 30 logs high. You would have one of the iron mill workers or one of the charcoal workers would continue to keep it stoked. You would make the pig iron out of the coke there. Then you would bundle it up, ship it back where the finished iron workers in England would actually create the bars to send it back. So it is a long process. That's why you need a lot of wood. All Catoctin Mountain Park, all 5,800 acres, they was clear cut by the charcoal industry. What was that? Out of the technology, yes. So some of the most skilled iron workers in the world were from the Black Forest. Actually, today the Catoctin Mountain Park, we actually have a sister park in the Black Forest, and we work on the same because we're both a recovering forest. We have to be careful not to say recovering alcoholics, but that's after work. But recovering forest, learning how second or third growth forest, and so those families were skilled. A lot of the they built because of those small principalities, and Germany's not unified to 1848, I think it is. And so a lot of those Germans actually came as an inter-servants. Also, during the American Revolution, after the Battle of Saratoga, the high German population in Burgoyne's army, the Hessians were actually brought down into Frederick and other places. And where there were high German populations, enticed them to actually stay or desert, because every soldier that deserted, the British government owed that principality a certain extra money. And so Washington realized by moving them into these areas where they had some of their fellow countrymen, they may realize that going back to serve in another war didn't seem as fun as maybe hanging out here in the United Colonies. And so some of them stayed and became skilled workers as well. And so it is a process of years and years of tradition. It doesn't take very long to learn the basic rudimentaries. One of the national parks I worked at, George Washington birthplace, National Monument, we actually did blacksmithing demonstrations for schools. and learning how to, I think I made one day successfully 12 nails in a 8-hour day. So at the time, I didn't tell my partner, who was a teacher, who had to deal with first grade all day. She goes, "How was your day?" And I said, "You really don't want to know. All I did was bang metal and make nails." And so it is a skill you learn with nails, then you go to hooks and so forth in the blacksmith, and then you go up, of course, to making munitions, because they're a little more volatile, especially when you're trying to put black powder into cannonballs. So you want to go in there? So these are just the diverse. I know it's going to be kind of hard to read. So you have the colliers, fillers, teamsters, company clerks, ore miners, of course, the foundry workers, wood cutters. So it does employ a lot of people. So it is a good industry magnet. And so that is why Mechanicstown was known as Mechanicstown, because not only did you have the one at Catoctin Furnace, you had a competing one farther up between Sevillersville and what is now Emmitsburg. And so you had these workers coming, these skilled workers, especially during the 18th century, because they did get removed from public jobs. And so they didn't have to join the militia. They didn't have to work on public roads, or they weren't called up for other duties. A lot of them did move on and so forth. One of the reasons the Johnson family is in Frederick County is that they're unsuccessful in their one in Eastern Maryland, because the skilled workers try to find ways to get out of their contracts, come to the West where there's more land opportunity. And so there was a bigger turnover. So in addition, they were encouraged, German immigrants, Irish immigrants, and other ones initially, because they actually cost less than African-American slaves. You could pay them a lower wage. You didn't have to feed them. You didn't have to clothe them. You didn't have to house them. And if they worked, I mean, some of these jobs like the colliers who had to keep the things stoked, that's a 24-hour job, because you can't let it burn down, because then you defeated the whole purpose. Tires you out, a lot of backbreaking work. If a Irishman or a German or indentured servant didn't make it their whole 6 years, you just got another one to come in. But if you lost an African-American slave in those 6 years of working, you lost that whole, they believe, that whole lifetime. So a lot of the African-American slaves actually learned some of the different jobs that were not as like teamsters and working in the foundry, because it was not as labor intensive as being the wood cutters and the colliers and so forth. So try to save that that labor force. And so this one, though, so this is what an iron mill would have potentially looked like inside. However, this one is not of Catoctin Furnace. This is actually of Saugus Iron Works, which is up in Massachusetts. Another big one that dates back. So right now, the National Park Service actually preserves about 3 different furnace operations in the eastern United States. You have, of course, Catoctin Furnace, which is shared with the state park here in Maryland. Right up about 2 hours up the road is Hopewell Furnace, which is actually, we work with them closely because they have a lot more documentation, because theirs family kept the records a little better. And then farther north, you have the Saugus Iron Works, which is a part of the National Park, Salem and Saugus Iron Works, or Salem Maritime, up in better known for where they tried a few witches, I think in the 17th century, Salem, same place. So, but just a sketch of how big the operation, how many people are working. Everything's shipped in, the anvils and so forth are shipped in from Great Britain. Of course, the tools in the back, you have the one on the right is actually fanning the fire to keep it going. And so I had to be ambidextrous because you had to continue to pump the fire with one hand, keep the iron in the side. And from personal experience, that is a lot of effort, and if you're uncareful, you get burnt very easily. So there's a few probably choice words early in my Park Service career when I got too close to the hearth. So you learn after like the 6th or 7th time. So, but yeah, if you want to hit the next. And so this one of the neat things that has been uncovered recently, and has now been incorporated into the experience there at Catoctin Furnace, is a short little trail that will go out to this landing. And at the end, this is the names on this plaque of all the people they know that served in the Catoctin Furnace operation at some time. At the heyday, they do know there was approximately 80 that were owned. And this is a quote from 1799. It's a translated entry from the diary of a German named John Frederick Schlegel. And he says, James Johnson, his brother and sons, particularly with the poor Negroes, whose inward and outward conditions are troubled. A little group of them gathered around me at the top of the furnace. And then he goes on to saying that he tried to preach the gospel, depicting the Savior as he redeemed them from his sins upon the cross through his suffering and death. They wept very much because they were bound to work so hard during the week, as well on Sunday in the iron smelter, and thus were seldom able to hear the word of God. My conversation came to an end. The signal was given, the pouring, and each of them had to get back to work. By 1830, Bryan and McPherson enslaved as many as 20 adult workers at the Catoctin Iron Works. The figure dropped off considerably by 1841. Those that did remain actually were very skilled artisans. And so none of the slaves appear to have been transferred, though, to the next owner, Peregrine Fitzhugh, who owned it from 1843 to 1856. There is no record of him owning any African-American slaves, only what they call domestic workers. So it could have been Irish, German, or freed slaves themselves. So the largest percentage of enslaved workers was actually between 1820 and 1843, when the Bryan family actually owned it, and it's filtered off. They also know that now there is evidence that the Catoctin Furnace was a location, the town of Mechanicstown was a location of the Underground Railroad, one of the last stops to get into across the Mason and Dixon line into southern Pennsylvania, where it also skirted into the small town where something happened in 1863. I think it's called Gettysburg. You might have heard of, there's a small battle there or something. But one of the houses on Cemetery Ridge, was actually a freed African-American as well. I think his last name was Bryan, and he tried to help push on the African-American escaped slaves coming through the area. So today the trail ends here, where you take a look into a nice brook beside Route 15. They did believe that some of the slave graveyard was destroyed by the expansion of 15, but some of the recoveries of some of the remains range from as young as 2 years old all the way up into they believe adult male and females at between 70 and 80. So wide range of over 35 to 40 remains were identified by name and records, and so there's still more probably in that general area or lost because of the road expansion of 15. This map here shows you all the routes, and I was trying to find one that zeroed in, and every time I did, it pixelated too much. But this is the routes of the Underground Railroad, how they went through. Of course, going down through the state of Florida to Cuba, Haiti, and so forth. Actually stealing on ships to go north through New York. Recently, the National Park Service has been doing studies and created a multi-park unit called Harriet Tubman National Historical Park. One of it's on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, the other part's up in Auburn, New York. And so it talks about how they try to get to places like Detroit, Buffalo, and others on the border and through as well. And so here, Maryland saw their slave population, of course, decrease, especially here in the western part of the state. Most of the slave population was toward the east or southeast of Washington, D.C., which still depicted a high southern kind of culture with the bigger farms or plantations. One of the best quotes, though, about this time when the iron furnace is starting to decline is a traveler to the city of Baltimore once remarked that Baltimore was the most northern southern city they'd ever visit and the most southern northern city they'd ever visited. So talk about a slight identity crisis there, but just a map to show you all the different routes. Of course, by the time of the American Civil War, and if the last map was confusing, I figured I'd up the ante a little bit to show you this one there. So there is a picture of the iron furnace there as the Federal Army comes through in 1863. If I can make a slight tangent, when you transfer the National Park Service, they give you 60 days to find a place to live. And so I was going around Frederick had finally settled on an apartment complex down near Prospect Hall. And I didn't realize that's exactly where George Meade was camped on the night of June 26th. So when I was leaving the front entrance, I'd come in through the back entrance off like Butterfly Ridge Road. I went back to the clubhouse and I said, I have to live here. I am a history nerd. George Meade camped here. I need to be in this apartment building. And they said, well, we have one available in the next building over. I said, okay, I'm about 100 yards from where Meade was camped supposedly. So every day I drive to work, and if my work phone beeps, I look over at the little monument to Meade and think, well, my day could be bad, but it could be worse. It could be him being tapped at 3 a.m. in the morning saying, hey, find the Confederate Army and get them out of Pennsylvania. So puts everything in perspective. So never a bad day at Catoctin Mountain. But the Army did camp through. There is records of them around Mechanicstown. They do know that Daniel Sickles' 3rd Corps was in around the Iron Furnace as well. John Reynolds is depicted there. It's a small little silhouette photo up at the top right. He probably came through late on the night of the 30th or early on the 1st hours before he was killed in action on the 1st day at Gettysburg. We do know that some of the scouts, the 3rd Corps would stay in the Emmitsburg and what is now Thurmont or Mechanicstown area. And some of the what was left of the small slave population probably also took the time to leave as well. Later on, George Custer came down to Mechanicstown and crossed 77 to fight the small battle of Smithsburg, which is out and so some of the records talk about them talking about the Iron Furnace, making mention of it, but no operation is going on. And so either the workers are gone or the operation has stopped as the armies compete through. You can head to the next slide if you like. So by the throughout the, and this is actually from the a image from about the 1940s. It's actually in the White House Historical Collection. Supposedly they all came around and take photos when before the national park, became a national park. It was an RDA, a recreation demonstration area, because the area had been deprived of its natural resources. Its cultural resources were in ruins. The New Deal legislation came in, bought 10,000 acres of the Catoctin Mountains. Today, 5,800 is the national park. Cunningham Falls has about 4,200. And he took pictures of some of the things around the area, showing why the federal government could bring people back in to help get things restarted. And so you had CCC, WPA. One of the last buildings built by the WPA in the area was actually part of what is now Catoctin Mountain Park Visitor Center. That was built in 1941 prior to the American entry into World War II. And so this is what it looked like to photographers employed by the federal government. And then this photo is now in the image archive. So the White House Historical Association, which is free to use and so forth. So great photos exist there. But throughout the 19th century, there was periods of instability, changes, and modernization to the Catoctin Furnace. They tried in 1857 a sophisticated new furnace powered by steam. They built a 33-foot high furnace stack to the complex, which they named Isabella, and that lasted until it blasted in 1893. They did build another 140-foot stack. They named Deborah next to Isabella. I was trying to figure out where they got these names from, if they're a family name or just like ships, they like to name them after women. But this new one was water powered, and the furnace could have a daily capacity of 35 tons of pig iron per day. Unfortunately, though, it lasted only a few years. In 1903, it was forced to shut down for good because it became unprofitable. Furnaces had lost the ability to compete with how the Industrial Revolution was going. And so company houses were eventually bought by families who had been employed in the furnace operation. So today, some of the houses still remain from once some of those workers occupied. And so one of them is actually restored to by the Thurmont Historical Society. So today, the furnace is unique in multiple ways. First, it is by National Register of Historic Places. So it has the designation there. The National Park Service, the Catoctin Furnace Historical Society actually preserves most of it today. They work closely with us. Cunningham Falls State Park is actually where the property is occupied or located. So they are the ones that maintain the trails, including the new slave graveyard or burial grounds trail. The National Park Service, I love this about my agency. We like to do big old resource studies that are about 50, 60 pages long. And then we like to put them and store them in places. And then every once in a while we make mention that, hey, we have a historic resource study. And then unless you know that we have historic resource studies, most people don't know they exist. And they're actually, anybody can read it, anybody can download it, anybody can get a copy. Because it's done on federal time, it is paid for by taxpayers. But we do sometimes a very bad job of communicating that we have these nice huge volumes of resource studies. So part of it is online. If you have trouble sleeping at night, it is a great resource. It is written like an academic resource study, and it's written in the 1970s. And so we do go back and relook at certain ones. This year, and actually in October, if you make it up to Thurmont, we're releasing one on the historic cabin camps that were built by the CCC and so forth. So enlightening reading there. The last thing is also this weekend is the Maryland Iron Fest that is going to go on in Thurmont. And part of my staff is actually only leading charcoal trail tours. So they'll talk about how the charcoal was made, how it was used in the side of the Catoctin Mountain Park, how they got it down the mountain to the furnace. And then this past year, we worked with a group of Amish workers from Indiana. So since they are a pacifist religion, they do not sign up for selective service. So and they trade off by coming to national parks and working for 30 to 45 days per year. And that satisfies that obligation. And they saw some of the exhibits on our trail and said that they could redo it. And so they actually built us a whole new charcoal sled. And then they got it transported all the way from Indiana to Catoctin Mountain Park. And they said they brought all that way, but someone had to get it from the parking lot down the trail because they weren't going to carry it that far. So what is that, 500 miles, and the last half mile, they were worried about carrying it. So luckily we have Camp David and a bunch of board Marines that sit up there. So we told the Marines, hey, the Navy said they could move this thing down the trail in 10 minutes. Marines came down and did it in 8. So it now sits there on the trail, and it shows you how big and wide these things are. The next thing we're going to do is actually reduce the charcoal hut and the collier hut next year. As our goal is to continue to improve this trail to show how intensive, but how important the furnace and the operation was to the founding of northern Frederick County and to a large population of Irish and German settlers who interwove themselves into the fabric of the early United States. And quite possibly, the cannonball that Washington fired first at Yorktown might have came from about 12 miles up the road at Catoctin Furnace. If not, as my uncle, who was a newspaper editor, once said, you don't let facts get in the way of a good story. So I will end with that story there, that the cannonball might have been launched to beat the British, made here in Maryland. So with that, I'd like to open up for if there are any questions or concerns, disturbances.
If you could, can you go back one to the picture furnace?
Yes.
Can you explain to us how, I know the colliers made the charcoal,
Yeah.
brought the charcoal down to the furnace. Charcoal is what burns to melt the breakdown of raw iron.
Yes.
So where in the furnace does all that happen, and then where does the actual iron come out?
So the so this is a tunnel back through there. So the tunnel is back through there. So this is one of the towers. This might have been either Isabel or Deborah. And so that's how it's mostly going to go out through the top of it. It's funneled through. The big iron thing is going to be collected and smelted into bigger, what do they call it, like kind of hogshead barrels. That's what they ship to the back end, but that's going to all be shipped back in its pig iron form back to Great Britain.
Okay, so you're dumping raw iron in the top,
So you're,
iron ore comes in at the top.
no, you're bringing it in, you're basically bringing it down in, sleds. And then
Now, when it gets to the furnace, where does the iron ore go?
the,
I mean, because doesn't the furnace burn the ore?
it's burning the,
Separate the ore from the. No.
it's burning the charcoal right
Yeah,
into,
charcoal burn
burns, yes,
to get the iron
Yeah.
out of the rock.
yes.
Okay, so where does the rock,
The-
the
byproduct?
raw iron, where does it sit in that furnace?
It's, so it's going to sit back, in the, down that kind of tunnel way in that building there. So this is the whole operation, so it's the tower and then the, furnace is, through that tunnel. Makes sense. I answered, I think I know, Yeah.
Let me,
Uh,
this is what I thought happened, that's why I'm not clear. I thought you had the charcoal in here. And that creates a lot of heat,
yes,
and that the iron sits up in here somewhere. And as it draws up through there, that heat breaks down the rock, but then the iron has to fall down. I mean, did they have screens or sieves or something?
okay, yes, yeah, no, yes.
I mean, I'm trying to understand how this operates.
Yeah, so, I'm sorry, I thought you were misunderstanding, like, no, what you just explained is exactly how that operation happened.
Okay,
Yeah, you're right, yeah. Sorry, I was thinking with the byproduct, what happened with the waste.
okay, so they took the ore in on the sides also instead of dropping it in on the top.
Yes,
Okay.
right. Yes,
Yeah, I was curious, you mentioned the CCC camps
yes,
and the WPA,
yes.
and they would kind of have come in like 1930. or
Yeah.
something.
30, what, 34? Yeah.
And is there evidence at the Catoctin Furnace of those develop, I mean, what they built there? Like
Yes,
there is at Catoctin Visitor Center?
so, at the furnace, you're saying, or at the park?
At first.
At the furnace, no, there is, because in actuality, they didn't even use the furnace, the CCC actually built the blacksmith shop in the park.
Oh, okay.
And there is one at now Round Meadow that actually we are going to, for the first time since the pandemic, bring back into operation, and start doing some demonstrations this summer. But it's over in the Round Meadow area, if you're familiar with the park,
My other question, as Mechanicsburg had changed its name to Paramount,
yes.
had Catoctin ever had a different name?
No, I mean, the mountain range, because it's Catoctin has been anglicized slightly. They believe that the Potawatomi Native Americans actually used it with a K, Catoctin, and so it was translated over into Catoctin sometime in the early 1700s. But the mountain range has always been called Catoctin.
Okay, because I'm just curious, because in the compendium from the Civil War, which is like this
Yeah.
big, if I were to do a search in there, and if I looked for Catoctin, I wanted to make sure it was spelled like we see it.
Yes, but now what you're going to also see is that there is a Catoctin Creek, there's a Catoctin Mountain Range.
Yeah.
And so there are multiple passes going through, especially in 62 and 63, as the armies move up to Middletown Valley, where Hagerstown and so forth is, the federal cavalry trying to get across. And so they could cross as far south as where Gambrill State Park is today. The creek actually goes into Northern Virginia as well. That's where that's what in Purcellville is where the Catoctin distillery is today. And everything, which upsets a lot of people coming to Thurmont thinking that we've got a distillery and got to tell them to go all the way to Virginia. But it is, so when you type in Catoctin, it's going to bring up all those.
My last comment,
Sure.
Deborah was the name of the plane.
Deborah was the name, okay. So, so it was, yeah, I was close, there. There.
And you wanted to know what time and where is the charcoal mountain for this weekend? Where does it start?
Sure. So the tour starts at Saturday and Sunday at 11 a.m. If you are familiar with Catoctin Mountain Park, there's the one road goes through the middle of the park called Park Central Road. And the charcoal trail is the second parking lot to the right past the visitor center. But there is a sign that says Thermont Vista Charcoal Trail. And one of my rangers with the cool Smokey the Bear hat will be there about 10:45 on either day. And so that's where you can head directly. If you forget by Saturday or Sunday, if you just stop in the visitor center before 11 o'clock, the rangers there will tell you how to get up to the trail itself. So it's about 1 mile north of the visitor center. So Camp David is within the confines of the Catoctin Mountain Park. Yes, sir. It's part of the reason that Catoctin becomes or stays a national park instead of giving everything back to the state of Maryland. They wanted to ensure that the property surrounding it would stay federal. So, Camp David, or as President Roosevelt called it, Shangri-La, actually sits on the highest peak in the Catoctin Mountain National Park and Cunningham Falls. So supposedly he was brought there and they took him out of the town car and he could breathe easily. He said his asthma wasn't bothering and he loved the view. So he called it My Shangri-La, which is I think, famous novel of the time. It was Eisenhower named it Camp David, thinking that every president would then change the name, but it kind of stuck. So the only, I think, name changes was one of the buildings. Nixon named the building where the press come as Poison Ivy. Ford thought that was a little too negative, so he changed it to Honeysuckle, which is still an invasive, but sounds a little nicer. So other than that, most of the buildings have stayed the same name. 1970, 78. Carter had two more buildings built for the president of Egypt and the prime minister of Israel, so they could be equal distance to where Carter was staying. So that way they could be. So I'd hate to be the contractors having to build those exactly the same distance from where the presidential house is. But and so yeah, presidents have come since Roosevelt, early 1940s. Any other questions, concerns, disturbances, complaints? So yeah, so there is 3 camps up at Catoctin Mountain Park. One of them is obviously Camp David. One of them is Camp Greentop, which is open for a large group reservations. It is also, so initially, one of the goals of building the camps up there was to give underprivileged or children with disabilities chance to get to nature. And so he built the initial camp called Misty Mount, and then nobody thought that building the cabin camp on the side of a hill was a good idea for kids that had physical disabilities. And so the first kids had major trouble going from the dining hall to their cabin. And so they spent more money to build a camp on top called Camp Greentop. Early 1940s, the place was used by the Maryland National Guard. And it was actually one of the funny stories is the British merchant sailors and Marines, ships that were damaged in the Battle of the Atlantic were getting repaired in Baltimore. So the Park Service invited them up to the Catoctin Mountain to have R&R. And he said they were the nicest chaps they ever met until about 6 weeks after they left, when the Park Service got hit with a $600 phone bill in 1941, because all those sailors did was call back to Great Britain, or tried to. And so it was an argument between Stimson, the Secretary of War, and Hicks, the Secretary of Interior, who was going to pay the $600 phone bill. Today, though, Misty Mount is open for individual like families or small groups. There's a dining hall there as well. It's open from May through end of October because the buildings aren't heated, so we have to winterize them. Greentop is being renovated right now and should be reopened by September. And then, of course, the third one, you have to be invited by someone higher up the food chain than me, and that's to get into Camp David. So, So the goal is to keep the outside, since they are historic properties, we do, I have to maintain them to a certain standard. Actually, there is a return to, using linseed oil to, on the side of the cabins to preserve them even better. It's used, more in Europe. And so actually down here in Frederick, you have the historic preservation training center. And so they've been, experimenting with it. And they're the gentlemen and ladies that go around the United States helping all the national parks with historic properties. Their central office is here in Frederick, on Monocacy National Battlefield. And so we do, for some reason, the US War Department wanted to paint them red. And so some of them are red. We're not quite sure why you want red cabins in the middle of the woods, but maybe that was the only paint they had left. Everything else they couldn't paint red in time of war. But so yeah, they are historic. And I think it's October 18th at the Thurmont Library. Our cultural resource manager will talk about the what goes on to preserving and writing these cabin camps. So it's a free program there at 7 o'clock at the Thurmont Library. So. Yes, sir. So some reason when we were became a national park unit in 1954, either by oversight or intention, no one put the word national in our title or legislation. So we're one of only, I think, 3 national park units out of the 424 that do not have the word national. We just think that we don't need that self-promotion. People just know that we're nationally good. But it is something that myself, the other program managers and the superintendent we hosted some of the Maryland, what is it, Von Holland and the states, or one of the 2 senators and Raskin's chief of staff to try to say, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we added the word national in here? So it is being put forward. We're not sure. It's been put forward by multiple superintendents over the years to get the word national put in there, whether that would change the designation to a recreation area or a national mountain park, whatever. We just like the word national because it'll tie us in. Most people see the arrowhead on 15 and go, oh, we didn't realize you guys existed. We were on the way to Gettysburg or Antietam or Harper's Ferry. But we are just like Prince William Forest Park outside of Quantico. They're another one that got started just like us and didn't get the word national in their designation. But right now there's 424 National Park Service units, and 62 of them are national parks, designated national parks. So yeah, we fall into the Department of the Interior. Oh, thank you. Stay behind the microphone most of the time too. That's the achievement there.